morning, everyone, and welcome to YDS, or I assume in many cases, welcome back to Yale Divinity School. I am Jennifer Herdt. Good morning. Thank you. Welcome. I am Jennifer Herdt. I'm the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs as of this fall here at YDS. I'm also Professor of Christian Ethics, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this opening faculty conversation on challenging unjust laws in church and society. I'm going to introduce our two faculty conversants this morning, and then we'll have some opening comments from Tom Ogletree, and then a conversation between Linn Tonstad and Tom Ogletree. And we need, I'm sure, to keep on schedule, be done at 9:30 so that you can be off to the next event on this very full schedule of events for today. But I do want to say a few words about each of our faculty members this morning. Professor Linn Tonstad joined the faculty in systematic theology in 2012, coming to us from the Perkins School of Theology, where she'd been on the faculty for several years. But really, she was coming back home to roost. We were very happy to reclaim one of our own because she did her MAR here at YDS and then went on for a doctorate at Yale downtown in religious studies, and wrote a dissertation that was supervised by Miroslav Volf and completed in 2009. She's currently writing a book on experimental Trinitarian theology, and she's the author of many articles, including an article on sexual difference and Trinitarian death in von Balthasar's Theodrama, and an article on hierarchy in Pannenberg's Trinity, among others. So obviously, if you can grab her afterwards, there are lots of interesting things to talk about. She's already become a much beloved teacher here at YDS, including for a course that she taught last spring on queer theology. And she gave an absolutely wonderful address at the fall opening convocation this year. Professor Tom Ogletree is undoubtedly known to many, if not all of you, and of course there could be very much to say about any former dean of YDS. I'm going to pick out just a few little tidbits and not attempt to give a full introduction. I enjoyed learning about him a little bit more and preparing to introduce him today. I hadn't known, for example, that he did postdoctoral study in 3 different countries. Many people can claim to have done that in France, Germany, and England, and went on to be active in many key professional organizations, including the Society for Human Values and the Association of Theological Schools. He served as the president of the Society of Christian Ethics. He's the author of numerous books, most recently The World Calling, The Church's Witness in Politics and Society in 2004, and he certainly hasn't stopped yet. He has a book that's due out in 2014 on the biblical foundations for Christian social teaching. He's been active in pastoral leadership and on various boards and committees within the United Methodist Church for decades. And as you know, the immediate occasion for our gathering today is the fact that this past year he officiated at the same-sex wedding of his son and is now facing canonical trial in the Methodist Church. He told the New York Times when interviewed in May that when a law is unjust, sometimes you challenge the law and try to change it, and sometimes you break the law. So here we have a veteran of the civil rights movement who's now embroiled in another struggle for justice, this time within the church. So please join me in welcoming both Professor Tonstad and Professor Ogletree this morning.
Well, so glad to see you here. This has been an amazing time. It's exhilarating to me to see the momentum that is building for change in terms of our treatment and of people without regard to their sexual orientation. It's a very significant and dramatic thing, and it's happening both in the wider society and in our churches as well. But I'm intrigued by the fact that there's still so many divisions. There's still so much resistance to this notion of simply inclusive practices that honor the dignity of all people without regard to sexual orientation. So only 14 states and the District of Columbia now acknowledge the right of same-gender persons to marry each other. And what's intriguing is how the court has played a role. In California, Massachusetts, more recently in New Jersey, or even the Supreme Court, this current one, which looks kind of divided, overruled the Defense of Marriage Act, which was a very striking achievement. But at the same time, there are still 30 states where same-gender marriages are illegal, so we have a long way to go. And the churches are experiencing a lot of division. I'm intrigued by the fact that the institutional structures of the churches are impacting how things unfold. For example, the most progressive church in this area is the United Church of Christ, which has, good for you, which has, congregational autonomy. And in fact, my wife is a UCC clergywoman, and the Guilford Church, where we often worship together, they are quite dramatically open and affirming. That's a central theme. And it's a part of the ethos of the place. And of course, our son had the privilege of growing up in that environment, where it helped him from the earliest years of his consciousness of his sexual orientation to be more self-confident. And of course, he knew also of my full support and trusted that from the beginning. But at the opposite extreme, you have, of course, the Roman Catholic Church, where you have highly centralized papal authority. Fortunately, Pope Francis is saying, we've got to stop this narrow focus on sexuality issues and look at more matters of justice and inclusion. So here is at least a movement, a spirit that's encouraging us for change. But what intrigues me is how the United Methodist Church, which has global membership, including Africa, Korea, Taiwan, Philippines, has a global church, but the rules of the Methodist Church, which are called the Discipline, the Book of Discipline, is managed and regulated by the General Conference of the United Methodist Church, which meets every 4 years, with an equal number of lay and clergy delegates from the church throughout the world based on the membership size and different annual conferences. But so these rules are binding upon all of us, whereas in the Episcopal Church, the diocese has a certain autonomy. And so it's not surprising then that the New Hampshire diocese has an openly gay bishop who's married, Gene Robinson. In fact, I love this book he's done on God Believes in Love, because it's very brief, very succinct, but very illuminating, and I recommend it to you if you haven't heard of it. Well, so the Methodist Church then, how do you cope with this national environment? It gets especially tricky when you realize that it takes a 2/3 majority of the delegates to the General Conference of the Methodist Church to make any changes in the Book of Discipline. And then those changes must be endorsed by 2/3 of the annual conferences represented in the Methodist Church. Well, the southern regions of the United States are very much opposed to inclusive marriage practices. And in the bulk of Africa, for example, you don't yet have a strong consciousness of the meaning of sexual orientation. That's something emerging within the culture, but not the way it has become more open in Europe or the United States or other parts of the world. So it means then that it's very hard to get a 2/3 majority vote to overrule discriminatory rules within the United Methodist discipline. In fact, the New York Annual Conference, which is strongly supportive of change, and that includes the bulk of Connecticut, they've offered resolutions since beginning in 1996 to give more regional autonomy or to overcome discriminatory practices that prevent pastors from serving the needs of their congregation as they see fit. What intrigues me then is that we have a set of contradictions within the United Methodist discipline that are very striking. For example, its motto is open hearts, open minds, open doors. That's powerful. And this is reinforced by a collection of social principles first adopted in 1908 and expanded and modified from time to time. In fact, I'm told that 1976 was one of the biggest changes leading to its current form. But it has a wonderful section in there called Social Principles, which is a kind of United Methodist affirmation of a Bill of Human Rights. And they stress inclusive practices within the church. The nurturing community discussion, for example, says we must embrace and include all without regard to race, gender, age, national origin, physical or mental conditions, and sexual orientation. Now that's in the discipline. But in 1972, the conservative wing within the church managed to get that statement modified to add the phrase, but homosexual practices are incompatible with Christian teaching. That's the first time that rule became so explicit, 1972. And then in 1984, they passed a rule that denied ordination to self-avowed practicing homosexuals. So you could be a member of the church, but in fact what they were saying is you're welcome to come to the church, but just like alcoholics are welcome. But that doesn't mean we endorse alcoholism. So they're saying you're welcome, but you've got to recognize that you've got a condition that you've got to change and you've got to be penitent about. And so they denied ordination to self-avowed practicing homosexuals. And then in 1996 is when they formally prohibited the celebration of civil unions or the presiding at same-gender marriages for clergy within the church. Now, of course, those are the rules that then began to affect me when I was asked by my son to preside at his wedding. I was already retired, and frankly, during my early years in the 80s and 90s and the early decade of the 20th century, when I was focusing on inclusive practices, I wasn't thinking that much about marriage because, as you know, the gay rights movement initially was not focused on that. So I hadn't thought about it much until my son asked me to preside at his wedding, and I was deeply moved by it. I did know that I was violating the rules. But I thought, gee, I'm an old guy. I'm 80 years old. I've been retired. Who's going to care? Well, what was striking is that there's this subgroup within the New York Annual Conference that carefully reads New York Times reports of weddings, and they spotted me and decided to make charges against me. And so here are the challenges we face. What do we do about this? Naturally, if the New York Annual Conference had more regional autonomy like the Episcopal Church, we wouldn't have a problem because our clergy and laity strongly support inclusive marriage practices. But the difficulty of making changes in the rule are daunting because it takes a 2/3 majority of all delegates to the General Conference, and then those changes have to be endorsed by 2/3 of the annual conferences represented by them. Now, again, that means now the opposition to change is still pretty overwhelming. So what do you do within the United Methodist Church? We've got grassroots movements for change. In fact, my own role, public role in this was made possible by MIND, Methodist in New Direction. In fact, I'm very indebted to Dorothy Bench, who is one of the leaders of that movement, because she facilitated the process of my word going public. And I realized that my son had actually wanted their wedding to be announced, and in part he was interested in a public declaration of the dignity and worth of all people. And so this thrust me into that light. And I hadn't anticipated I would ever have this kind of opportunity to be, as it were, a public witness for a change within the United Methodist Church and within the wider society. So this has been kind of an overwhelming opportunity for me. Well, of course, charges were then finally formally made against me for violating the laws of the discipline, which said I couldn't preside at a same-sex marriage. And so Bishop McLee, in the New York Annual Conference, called for a just resolution process. And what's intriguing about it is that the discipline is not primarily about a book of laws to maintain order. The word discipline really is related to the legacy of cultivating disciplines within the community of faith that will enable people to grow in faith and indeed to be made perfect in love in this life. That was a Wesleyan vision, to be made perfect in love in this life. And so when you have a charge, it's not merely legal. It calls for a just resolution. So it's like in Corinthians when Paul is dealing with conflicts within the church. He calls them to seek to find ways to work through their conflicts so they can restore the integrity of their faith community despite that. So that's what was going on, the search for a just resolution of the complaint. And the bishop emphasized in my meeting with the man filing the charge that his name was Page, Reverend Page. He said, remember, he was not acting as a pastor of a congregation. He was acting as a father of his son. In fact, my son is like his mother in a UCC membership. So we're kind of working in two different denominations. When I met with Mr. Page to discuss this matter, I said, why are you filing the charge? What's at stake for you? His answer was simple. You broke the law. That's all he said. I was rather surprised by that. And I said, well, Jesus broke the laws of the temple. And he challenged the purity codes of the Pharisees. And then I couldn't resist citing Dr. Martin Luther King, who in his letter from a Birmingham jail first declared that an unjust law is no law. It should not be granted authority. And so I said, how can I commit myself to obeying a discriminatory law that is unjust, that mistreats certain people? And he was not willing to make any adjustment. He said, if you're willing to promise never to do this again, then I'll drop my charge. But I said, I can't do that in conscience. So all of a sudden, I was thrust into the open. Well, this is why it's become so critical then as a vital movement within United Methodism. Potentially that could divide us. It's happened before. In fact, I love the opening section of the discipline, which reminds us of our history. We're not an infallible people. We had accommodated slavery. We had racial discrimination built into our church at one time. We denied ordination of women. We believed in their subordination. And we had to struggle to make those changes. We're now going to add a new chapter, that we denied the full rights and dignity of people based on gender And we're going to change that, but we've got to fight the battle. And we're motivated then to do that by challenging an unjust law. So that's what we're about.
So thank you for that beautiful and succinct discussion of some of the challenges facing us structurally and denominationally in thinking about these issues. Now, as a systematic theologian who also works in pure theology, I can't help but want us to talk a little bit about the theological issues at stake.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I know, totally unexpected, right? So debates in Christianity over sexuality tend to take similarly bankrupt forms on both sides of the issue, right? Opponents of the full participation of queer persons in the lives of the churches tend to tear sexuality out of historical context, proof texting at us, and so on and so forth, whereas proponents of the full participation of queer persons in the lives of churches tend to respond by some sort of anemic assertions about the differences between sexuality now and then, and something about God's love for everybody. And so everybody thinks they've addressed the issue, having done so, of course, in no particular whatsoever, talking completely past each other. How do we start developing resources for thinking in better theological ways about these issues? How do we move past the question about whether homosexuality ought to be lumped in with rape and incest or whatever the case might be? And how do we take more seriously the kinds of theological questions that are at stake here about how we draw boundaries around who counts as a religious insider or a religious outsider in Christian contexts?
Yeah, I think that's a critical issue, obviously. And of course, when people said, what do the scriptures say? And what's intriguing is that you have a hard time finding some. So people search and search, and there are about 6 clusters that people have found, and this is proof texting, of course, where you're looking for text that you can use to justify the beliefs you already hold. You're not opening yourself up to Scripture. And I said, well, then if you are so convinced, these texts don't talk about homosexuality. They talk about lust out of control, you know, like rape, incest, and then they talk about sodomy, but it's all just lumped together as kind of sex out of control. Well, none of us are advocating sex out of control. That's not the issue here. So I'm saying those texts don't really help us here unless you read them in a sort of self-interested way. But if you want to cite Scripture, then there's a much stronger biblical case for polygamy. Yeah, we could support polygamy. So what's intriguing is that if you want to find a group of texts that seem to be pertinent to the justice and well-being, there are hundreds and hundreds of them that talk about the inclusion of all people, the care for those who are vulnerable, who are sick, who are poor, who are abused. And of course, that's Jesus' message. In fact, the poor opponents of gay marriage can't find anything that Jesus said that helps their case. Isn't that terrible? In fact, I sometimes joke that, well, who was this beloved disciple? What did that mean? Was Jesus gay? I said, you can make that case as well as you can make some of the cases you're making. But because his mission was to include. No one is unclean. No one should be cast out as unworthy. You welcome us all. We're all on a pilgrimage. And so, sure, gay and lesbians are sinners just like those of us who are so-called straight. They're on a path of growing in faith and nurturing. So we've all got things to learn, but let's recognize here that these are people claiming their own dignity. In fact, I love the growing evidence that sexual orientation is genetic. So it's not a choice. And I've certainly learned that. I knew when my son was experiencing this and an older daughter who's lesbian, they didn't choose this. They had to come to a sense of who they were as they were growing up. And my job as a father was to help them do that and to help them know that you are a wonderful person. And I'm so proud of what they've achieved and what their lives are about, because they are both really committed to fostering a more just and open and inclusive society. That's their vision. So they're not just pushing their own interests. They're trying to reach out and care for others and their well-being. So they inspire me. I'm proud of them.
I bet they're very grateful to have you for a father. So I wonder, though, if that
and
raises...
a mother, too. She's wonderful.
I wonder, though, if that raises one of the challenges in the ways that we think and speak about sexuality in relation to the question of identity.
Yeah.
Because on the one hand, for opponents of the full participation of queer persons in the life of the church, there's an absolute stumbling block laid down in Jesus' own words, and that has to do with adultery being sin in the heart, right? That rules out the possibility of making the distinction between orientation and practice, right? It makes the language of practicing homosexual completely irrelevant in Christian terms, because Jesus refuses that distinction. The question is attraction, not practice. And on the other hand, when persons who are in support of the full participation of the lives of queer persons in the lives of the churches tend to talk about identity, there's a couple of challenges that come up in that regard. Inside queer theoretical circles, the question of homosexuality as identity is probably about as contested as any question could be. It's a way of potentially accepting the status of a question where we've produced these identities in the process of debating about them. Some queer theorists argue that the production of sexuality as identity is a function of distracting us in some ways from issues like poverty, like economic violence, like severe structural injustices. It, in a sense, makes us concerned about personal practices and preferences, and we read those as somehow immutable in the human person. Now, there's a lot of questionable assumptions about the human person that are entailed in that. On the other hand, the moment we stake our claim on identity, we raise some problems for one of the acronyms in the alphabet soup, right? GLBTQ, the B, right? The question of whether you could change if you wanted to change, or whether if, for instance, for those of us who are bisexual, the question of change isn't really the question at all. How do we move past this sort of stuckness around issues of identity? The same thing can be seen then in debates over political issues, the political status of same-sex marriage. Now that has, of course, become one of the flagship issues of the contemporary gay rights movement. But that, too, is the source of a lot of debate inside queer political activist circles, because it seems to indicate a sort of privatization that's happened arguably after the more radical proposals that happened during and in response to the AIDS crisis, where poverty, structural injustice, homelessness, violence against queer persons, societal indifference to queer persons took priority over the desire to gain marital rights. How would you think about the ethical issues that are entailed in how we prioritize our activism in different directions, and how we think about personal identity from a Christian perspective?
Well, what of course is important about this is that all of those issues matter. And naturally, we face that problem all the time. We're finite. We can't just take on every problem in the world. So we have to decide what can be priorities, where we can make a difference. But I was impressed, for example, with the Massachusetts court ruling. In fact, I hadn't read it thoroughly until my son wanted it to be read at his wedding. And he wanted it read by his older sister, who lives in Boston and is lesbian and married and has 2 children with a male donor who is gay. And so she was a perfect person. But what was striking about the Massachusetts ruling is it didn't sound like legal jargon, the way we normally associate with court rulings. It rather emphasized the fact that marriage is a fundamental institution within the society. In other words, it's not just personal. It's a structure that has a foundational role in the well-being of society. And they were recognizing that, if anything, marriage as an institution is getting weaker. And so they were saying, because it's so fundamental, you cannot deny people the right to participate in it, even though you're not requiring them to. In other words, you're not saying that marriage is the only thing that matters, but that marriage is terribly important. And I realized that that was a part of my son's experience. That is, he and his commitment to Nick Haddad, these are both quite extraordinary men. Nick Haddad's a lawyer, his husband, and his parents are actually from Lebanon. They're second generation. And so they're in the Orthodox traditions. And for them, adjusting to their son's sexual identity was a bigger challenge than it was for Tom, because he'd grown up in a welcoming congregation. But what was intriguing to me is that they didn't, while it was terribly personal to them, I mean, they really love and care for each other and even want to be parents, adoptive parents. But at the same time, they view themselves as people called to give leadership in fostering well-being in the society as a whole. So they see this as a component of a larger vision. But it doesn't soften the, I mean, what I take as forceful about your comment is a reminder, again, that we can't focus on everything. And it is true that even the gay rights movement did not initially focus on marriage. That's become a central part of the issue only in the last couple of decades. So this is clearly not the only thing that matters, and it doesn't mean that for every person that's the priority in life. But it does mean recognizing that this is an institution of fundamental importance.
So how then do we think about the relationship between questions like marriage and other priorities? Now, in many queer circles, one of the sort of radical things about queer life is the way in which it expands networks and bonds beyond biological families, beyond legally recognized institutions, and into something like what is sometimes called families of choice, or what we might think of as unnatural kinship networks. Now, there's another kind of institution that tends to wish to pressure people into imagining new forms of life, unnatural kinship institutions. And I think we all know which institution I'm thinking of, the church, right? That's supposed to be one of the key things that it pushes us toward. Similarly, we see this sort of concern in the New Testament at various points about our desire to re-regulate institutionally, about our desire to conform, as it were, to the kind of expectations of the society around us in terms of where we place our energies and the ways that that cuts us off from each other and creates divisions within the body of Christ in the way that arguably this issue continues to do. How do we think about expanding the way we talk and think about sexuality beyond questions like marriage, taking then for granted, as I think we both do, that there's no debate to be had about marriage, realistically. I don't think there's anything to talk about here, obviously. Persons should have the right to marry. There's no question about that. It's a legal institution. It's, to the extent that it's a church-sanctioned institution, we may want to talk about whether that was a good idea, but it is at this point. But how do we move past that? In other words, if we've decided, as it were, taking we now as a sort of placeholder for those of us who do think that marriage is something that should be taken for granted as something that persons of all gender and sexual identities can participate in, what do we say after that? What's the next thing on the agenda? If we've talked about that question, if we've made up our minds on that question, what do we say next?
And clearly, I place a lot of weight on becoming church as a central part of the Christian message, but also the Jewish message. You know, the synagogue is vitally important for the faithful well-being of people. Now, that's a reminder that we're not isolated individuals. We are social beings by nature, and so of course it is the case that we need to be cultivating bonds and relationships among humans. And a democratic society, for example, won't function well unless there's something like a social bonds within the wider society where people embrace one another despite their differences. So part of the crisis of democracy in the U.S. right now is the fact that we've kind of fragmented into divisions that can't even talk respectfully with one another. And that's a serious social problem, in other words. So I go back to saying we can't do everything, but it is certainly the case that the gay rights movement is correct that building wider bonds must be an integral part of their mission, but at the same time, they're not simply wanting to be an isolated gay group. They are also wanting to be a part of a larger inclusive community. At least that's the way I see things. So naturally, people may feel their only hope is to maintain an isolated set of relationships. But that's because the harsh realities don't give you much hope. And so sometimes we do have to accommodate that. We have to just hang together even though we've got to be, as it were, withdrawn. But it's not the ideal situation. The ideal situation is that the bonds we are building can then be expanded into the wider society. And that it does intrigue me that Paul's letters kind of suggest that. That is, who we are within this community of faith, we expand. And I see that in Jesus' mission. We're reaching out to strangers. We're not just gathering with those with whom we are building deeper bonds. We're always reaching toward a wider human community because ultimately we see that we all matter.
So as Jennifer mentioned in her introduction, in the spring I taught the first formal class on queer theology that's being taught here at Yale Divinity School. And in doing so, I had to make some choices about how we approach that debate. Because of course I could have happily taught a 4-semester sequence and not made it through most of the interesting issues. And the way I set it up was in part to think about these questions of identity, of political goals, of how it is that queer lives and loves challenge us to reconceptualize our understanding, perhaps even of who and what the human person is, challenge us to think differently about the sort of prospects for integration and wholeness, and perhaps take more seriously the broken and fragmented status that all of us experience as finite creatures, as sinful creatures in our relationships to one another and before God. Now, you, of course, have a long and distinguished career as a theological educator. I'm only in my 5th year of teaching at this point.
Right? In fact, I told her it broke my heart that she didn't come until after I retired.
Oh, you're so sweet.
Because I got to know her as a student.
That's
even.
right.
Go ahead.
So thinking about how we provide resources as theological educators for our students who are going into theological education, for our students who are going into various forms of activism, and for the churches and leaders of churches and members of churches with whom we're all in conversation in different ways. What kinds of suggestions would you have in that direction?
Well, I don't have any wisdom other than, again, what I see as the legacy of the church, where it's an inclusive community by nature, if we understand it properly. But it's also constantly reaching out for the well-being of others. In fact, your descriptions about how you grapple with identity, keep in mind that was also part of the civil rights movement. That you have to ask, what does it mean to be black or African American? In fact, one of Jim Cohen's books that I like so much is on Martin and Malcolm in America, where he highlighted two contradictory views. Malcolm X said, don't kid yourself. These white people are evil. You're not going to have a decent integrity life until you pull apart and become closed in upon yourself. Well, again, that's a little bit like, becoming a part of a monastery or something. In other words, that's a part of the Christian story too. The only way we can be faithful is to be, as it were, withdrawn as much as possible from the wider society. But the opposite was Martin Luther King, where you have a vision of justice that includes all people. And what I liked about Cone is his work. We'd had the privilege of meeting when we were in seminary. And in fact, he'd grown up in Arkansas and I'd grown up in Alabama. And after a time at Garrett Theological Seminary in Chicago, we both decided that Chicago was just as racist as the Deep South. It's just that they were more sophisticated. That is, the crudeness of racism in the Deep South was very visible, but it was a little more subtle in Chicago. So we knew we had a real challenge. But it's not surprising then that part of the battle for inclusion means, who am I? Well, I see that in the feminist movement as well. What does it mean to be a woman? And so, after all, being a woman was clear. You stay home, you have children, and you manage the household, cook meals, and clean everything. That's what it means to be a woman. You're not supposed to do anything else. Well, the feminist movement said, I don't want to say it's wrong for me to have a baby or that I never want to have children, but I have other visions too. So the point is, identity issues were a part of these social struggles as well. And therefore, it makes complete sense to me that the identity issues are part of discovering who you are when you're gay. And I see that in my son. That is, in fact, I asked him, why haven't you ever joined the gay pride parades? And he said, Dad, that's not my calling. Because he viewed it as an attempt to, as it were, deal with your oppression by, as it were, making a fool of yourself. In other words, you were mocking the system by the gay pride parade. But he said, that's not the way I want to do it. I want to be in there shaping and reconstructing our social order. Well, so the point is that the identity issues are a part of every struggle for social change. And we continually have to face it. And that's why I'm so inspired by her work here. That is, that this is more is going on than just say the right to marry, although that's an important issue. Should we let other people talk?
Yes, we should. You're doing such a beautiful job of highlighting both disagreements within these communities as well as the need for inclusion in conversation. So why don't we extend that to our community here this morning?
We share a common vision here, I think.
I'm Dick Moore, class of 61 here. I'm not a Methodist minister because I was told I couldn't be ordained in the Methodist Conference in 1962. So I've put my commitment elsewhere, other profession, College of Missions actually. And this is my spouse, Wallace Pinfold. We were married illegally in Maine in 2006, married legally in California in 2008, and now we're legally in Maine because Maine is just one of the descendants that you know about this site.
Yeah.
Why don't you become the Gene Robinson of the Methodist Church? The New York Times is already interested in your case. I read about your son in the society section. I read about you and this upcoming trial in the New York Times. They're very interested in your case, and they certainly have a pulpit in America. And wouldn't it be sort of interesting if you were to be purposely obstreperous during this trial, be defrocked, and then you would raise such anger that I think the Methodist Church would have to reconsider its situation. There's a great opportunity here for you.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that if it weren't for Dorothy Benz, who's our kind of managing director of MIND, this is the organization called Methodist in New Directions. This is one of several grassroots organizations within the denominations to bring about change. She's the one who saw the announcement and then heard about charges because of her own connections with the Methodist Church. And she was denied ordination too. She has a PhD and specializes now in communications, including the media. So she was the one who contacted the New York Times and the Washington Post and the public broadcasting PBS station to persuade them to pursue this issue. In other words, I wouldn't have gotten this attention. Well, certainly wouldn't have if Tom had never published it, they announced it in the Times, no one would have ever known about it. And there are a lot of weddings performed where there are no charges ever. So I never expected to be in the public anymore. I'm an old guy, you know. But because of her, it became public. And I did realize that I had a new calling that I had not experienced before, and that this was my opportunity to become a part of that public witness. And indeed, I have been devoting almost all of my time to that in the last year. And in fact, my son's anniversary was this past Sunday. So now they've been, that is the first anniversary of their legal marriage. They've been bonded together deeply for about 6 years now. So, but the point is, suddenly I'm seeing that this is an opportunity. But what strikes me about it is you can't do this as an isolated individual. If Martin Luther King had been alone in his letter from a Birmingham jail, it wouldn't have gotten that much attention. It's because there were already grassroots movements that he was involved in facilitating that brought him into that public eye. Well, similarly, it's Methodist in New Directions. It's the Reconciling Ministries Networks. These are grassroots organizations. These are not official structures within the United Methodist Church. These are United Methodists who are getting together to mobilize for change. And I've had people say, why don't you just leave the church, the Methodist Church? I mean, you can join the UCC. You'd be welcome there. In fact, my wife has said that at times. Why are you bothering me? The Methodist Church is a hopeless church, stuck in rules that are so rigid and unchangeable, and yet suddenly the challenge is to say, no, we've got to recognize that there are rules within this discipline which are unjust and discriminatory, and they contradict the fundamental principles of our church itself. And we've got to stand up for our fundamental principles, which are open and affirming. Open hearts, open minds, open doors. Otherwise, we're just contradicting ourselves. And at least I'm grateful for the fact that the Methodist Church confesses its vulnerability to sin. So I do view this as a chance now that it's not just Methodists. I'm intrigued by the fact that I'm hearing from other denominational bodies which are struggling with their own system. And like the Presbyterian Church, I hadn't thought about this, but the Presbyterian Assembly voted to legalize with a majority vote. It wasn't 2/3. You don't have to have 2/3 in the Presbyterian Church USA, majority, to grant ordination rights to people without regard to sexual orientation. Then suddenly, congregation after congregation began to withdraw from the Presbyterian Church. And they could do that because each congregation owned its own property. But a Methodist church can't do that. The only way you could do the equivalent is to get all the members of your church to pull out and then form an independent congregation. And then the church would realize it can't support that building anymore that's empty. And so they might sell it to you. But the point is that the structure within the Methodist Church, you can't handle it that way. And that's why I'm inspired by King's comments that he recognized that prospects for legislative or judicial change were simply too slim to advance the civil rights movement. Any effort was constantly being knocked down. So there was only one option left. It's to expose unjust laws by refusing to honor them and accept their legitimacy. And so naturally this started the idea of militant, nonviolent, direct action. The focus is on building peace, but challenging unjust laws. And I think that's an inspiration for us. Here, I saw your hand.
So your son's partner invited you to have a service of marriage in the United Church of Christ.
No.
Let's say theoretically,
Oh.
we changed the congregational setting Does the discipline forbid you to exercise your authority in the United Church of Christ, even though your ordination is recognized?
That's correct. That is, the discipline has a section called chargeable offenses, and it mainly deals with things that clergy do wrong. And one of them is celebrating a same-gender civil union or performing a same-gender marriage. They use the word same-sex. And that's a chargeable offense, no matter where I did it. Because after all, their wedding was held in the Yale Club in New York City.
Very secular.
And so it was, as it were, a secular environment. Yeah.
So what sanctions will you go to jail and serve time? Or do they withdraw your ordination papers or stop your pension?
The poor things, their capabilities are very limited because of I even learned that they can't take, I have still a little small Methodist pension. It's not very much because I spent most of my life as a professor. But I did serve as a pastor while I was a student for 5 years where I had money paid into my pension. And so they can't even take that away from me, I've learned. I was intrigued by one of the women who got charged with performing a same-sex marriage. Well, also for being openly lesbian herself and married, is that they kind of slapped her on the hand. They said, your authority will be removed for 1 day next year, but you will still be paid. So it means that in the areas like New York and Pennsylvania, New England, there's not real support for these laws. So you go through, as it were, some sort of formal process, but normally there's a slap on the hand is about the worst you can get. So even if you take the worst case, which would be depriving me of my credentials as an ordained United Methodist pastor, what difference would that make? That wouldn't change my, I'm retired. I'm not serving as a church. I was a professor. I was a dean. So it wouldn't affect me. So in fact, there's little they can do. So in part, my curiosity is why did they want to pursue me? Because if anything, choosing to file charges against me, especially since I actually contributed a major part of the discipline, it's not a major, it's a small one. It's about 15 pages, but it's called Our Theological Task, where I played the main role in drafting that document between 84 and 88, and it was adopted in 1988. But the point is, there's not much way they can damage me. In other words, it wouldn't change. In fact, the state of New York would still recognize my right to perform weddings because once you get the right, they can't take it away from you. And that's true in Connecticut, so I could still perform marriages if I wanted to.
We have time for one more question.
Yeah.
See someone there.
Apart from religious institutions, it strikes me that another way to challenge unjust laws from within the church for societal good would be for clergy and others who refuse to act as agents of the state. And we have an instance in Kentucky where a church and congregation has fully endorsed and supported the pastor's decision not to sign civil certificates of marriage until such time as we get rid of our ridiculous law that says that marriage constitutes one man and one woman, and that's removed from our Constitution. And if that kind of groundswell began to move, which seems to me to be also addressing the separation of church and state in a way that would be productive as well for the societal good, we might have another opportunity to change the church as well as the world around us.
Yeah, I think you're quite right. Just quite briefly, after all, notice that marriage is a legal institution in the United States and that there are privileges that go with it, especially in the tax code. And so naturally, some people who are gay or lesbian or bisexual or transgender who want to marry a same-gender person will receive benefits that are not available to them now. And yet, Tom and Nick didn't marry because they wanted to get more financial benefits from it. They married because they wanted to bear witness to the importance of marriage as an institution. But still, your point is well taken, because it reminds us that this is an issue that operates both within the political realm and within the life of churches. And indeed, it's an ecumenical issue. In fact, if you're a Roman Catholic and you were to do this, you would probably be immediately expelled from office, which is what happened to my colleague Margaret Farley. So strictly speaking, she's lost her status as a legitimate nun. But that doesn't mean her witness doesn't have integrity. If anything, it has more integrity, because we know she's speaking the truth. And so I think you're quite right that this is an issue that is important. That's why, again, why I'm willing to stay Methodist to fight it, because there's a movement to fight it, and the struggle within the church has implications for the wider society. And we've got that challenge.
I know there are a lot more questions. I encourage you to come up and try to speak with Tom and Linn, but thank you so much, both of you.